Governor, do you mind if I go first?
Go ahead.
If I could respond to that in context of all the other issues that you raised, because I think you framed this in a way that's incredibly constructive and informative to the conversation we need to have. That there needs to be a focus both on how we build the reserve and then what mechanisms are in place to draw down from the reserve. I think that the example that you used specifically with respect to a year where you found a $20 billion shortfall and found a $20 billion reserve is exactly the kind of issue we should be wrestling with. And when you look at ACA 4, I'm one of only 2 people left in office who helped negotiate the terms of ACA 4. And the piece that was my must-have piece was that you could never have a mechanism where you drew down the entirety of the funds in 1 year. And so the language that I put into ACA 4, which also informs the conversation that we're having with respects to AB 2X1, is that there has to be, at minimum, a multi-year drawdown so that you avoid exactly the kind of kick the can down the road scenario that you put forward. So in ACA 4, I suggested that in the first year you could never draw down more than half, and that you could only draw down if there was enough money to draw down over 3 years. AB 2X1 anticipates that same sort of multi-year drawdown. As we have the conversations, we can work on what the mechanisms are. The other issue I want to state is you talked about rigidity, and I think what you really mean is a thoughtful, disciplined, deliberative process that requires broad-based consensus that you're in an actual crisis. That it can't be a singular statement from one party or one individual saying we're in a crisis, we're going to draw down the reserves, which is why in its construct, AB 2X1 no longer allows the governor unilaterally to make a declaration of an emergency, but rather it requires the governor to make the declaration, the legislature to act as well in concurrence. Now, lastly, with respect to the specifics of your question, whether that threshold is 2/3 or somewhere below that, I think is a completely appropriate issue for us to work out together as we move forward. I am neither overly committed to a simple majority, nor am I overly committed to a supermajority of 2/3, but we should figure out a mechanism that is hard enough to achieve, that people don't do it lightly, but achievable so that people can't frustrate a collective understanding of a crisis. What we don't want to do is create a situation where the state is in absolute, actual economic, budgetary crisis, and a few people are able to hold up the ability to respond accordingly. So I'm open to discussions of where on that continuum that threshold should be.
Yeah, your question goes to what's the restraint on the spending of whatever's in the reserve. Higher than a majority is one mechanism, but the legislature could also define the conditions that would permit withdrawal. So I think we ought to explore both a vote threshold and a specification that these conditions, 1, 2, or 3, must occur or no money comes out. So I think this is a matter that we will explore in the next week or so. But,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, we have a couple of other members who wanted to comment. I've started a list. Mr. Jones-Sawyer, followed by Ms. Harkey, followed by Mr. Daly.
Okay. And I, too, want to echo and thank you for bringing this to us. And I also want you to know, as one of the members, that if the voters so decide to give me 12 years, we'll have 12 years, which is much different than what went on in the past. And I saw many of the members here, members not only in my district, another district, coming back when the budgets were just horrible. And I know how devastating it was to those elected officials and to the communities that were involved. And this whole concept and this whole dialogue of having a rainy day fund is extremely important. If you talk to the average citizen and then you ask them, what would you do once you got out of debt, once you got out of hard times, they would say, I want to pay off my credit card and I want to put some money away for if times get hard again. We need to have a serious discussion about the rainy day fund. We need to put everything on the table and deliberate. Because for me and several of the other members here who may enjoy 12 years, I know what happened 12 years before, and a lot of it was not pretty. And even though I jokingly say, for 100% of the time I've been elected, I've had great budgets, but I've only been elected 1 year. And I'm not naive enough to say that this will continue for the next 11 years. And so I commend you, because when that day comes, we have to be smart. We have to be smarter than we ever have been before. And I think this kind of discussion and this kind of legislation and amendments are the way we can build voter confidence in what we do. And ultimately, when those bad times do happen, people will say they thought ahead, they were deliberate, and even though we may still not be able to cover all our debts, they know we made the best attempt and the smartest attempt possible. So thank you for bringing this forward.
Ms. Harkey.
Thank you. First off, I'd like to thank you for bringing this forward as well, because I think the other ACA 4 that we had originally passed is probably coming off the table pretty quickly. I liked a lot of ACA 4. I thought it was very good. One of the things that I like about this, quite honestly, is the tying to capital gains. Capital gains is truly one of our largest problems in the state. We have lived from boom to bust. And I said that at the beginning of my tenure here in the Assembly. Being one of the Depression babies, of which only Speaker Perez and Ms. Skinner are, we came in with the crash. Mm-hmm. And everything...
I came in with the crash, too, in 1938.
That is your birthright, Governor. Anyway, it was pretty dismal and grim, and 5 all-night sessions, and getting to know members of the Assembly a lot more than we would have liked to. It was pretty miserable. And we just kept jerking from solution to solution and deficit to deficit. So one of the things I really want to try to control is the ability of the governor to declare an emergency and the legislature just go along. Because we saw that. We have, let's say, good gov, bad gov situation. I trust that Governor Brown will hold the line before he declares an emergency. However, he will only be here for another term. That brings us back to what happened previously, where the legislature was running amok and there wasn't really any supervision for the spending side. And I can go back to the bonds that we passed, that the voters approved, and all of the implementation of the long-term $15 billion long-term debt that we plugged the cash flow gap for in 2004. I mean, all of these things the people of California voted for because they thought it was the solution for the state, and it ended up being our demise. And so I really believe that I'd like to see a little more restraint on the being able to withdraw, because I do think we have some now. I'm not so sure that goes into perpetuity, and by the time the next crash hits, it'll probably be a different governor. The reduction of debt, I personally would like to see that be our budgetary debt, or as the governor calls his mountain of debt. I've always seen that as a structural cash flow shortage. It was something that we accumulated in the crash. It has no relationship to our bonds or long-term debt other than the $15 billion that we borrowed to plug a cash flow gap. So I would like to see it go to a budgetary debt such that we can return. We have a good cash flow now, but we're still borrowing, and we've still got other accounts that we borrow from, so we can maybe return some of those things. We have long-term funding, $50 billion we had. I'm not sure what we've got available. Maybe looking at some of that long-term debt and using Article 16 to eliminate it would be really nice. It allows the legislature to eliminate any debt that the voters have approved and the legislature has deemed is probably no longer a good idea, or maybe we can use it in other ways. For example, we have a water bond coming. We need the water bond. Can we eliminate something else that takes the place of that? I think we can. So without getting into any specifics, I appreciate the conversation. I would love to see this move forward with a little more input, and I look forward to working with both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Daley.
Thank you. This is a great day for California, and I want to commend Governor Brown and Speaker Perez for bringing this forward. This is an excellent package. This is a great start to something that's been long overdue. We need a meaningful and intelligent rainy day fund, and I believe this package is just that. I look forward to engaging in the final details and supporting this 100%. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Weber.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the Speaker Perez and to Governor Brown for coming today and obviously for sharing something with us that's very, very important. I'm one of the new kids on the block in terms of the budget, not only just being in the Assembly, but the budget itself. And I welcome the conversation that's going to come around this with regards to this topic that's extremely important. Because one of the things I've discovered in conversations with all of the hearings, and in Sub 1 you have a lot of hearings, that, the past few years, as I saw from the outside and now see from the inside, there was a lot of pain inflicted on groups in the state, But one of the greatest pain was the up and down pain. Mm-hmm. The fact that people did not know what we were doing, did not know when it was going to be good, when it was going to be bad, and were sitting and waiting for your statement, waiting for May Revised, waiting and waiting because they didn't know if it was going to be boom or bust, and they didn't know if there was anything there to provide any kind of stability and any transparency about what was going to happen at the state level. And we saw it in our schools, we saw it in our social service programs, and I think people saw it up and down the halls of this facility. This would probably, for once, give people some idea of what the future might look like, and that's important. As I've tried to deal with persons in Sub 1 and looking at various efforts to try to rebuild some things or to move forward the future that's a little different for California, I say to people, we need to have a multi-year plan. We need to have a plan for what we're doing, and this really, and people seem to be receptive to that, whether you're going to help them or not help them, but to know what's coming, to know what's there. And I think more than anything that's happened over the past few years is the real feeling of instability among our agencies, our workers, our employers, not knowing whether it was going to be a great year or a bad year, meant that they themselves could not plan their own lives as they were accustomed to planning. This, I think, in its initial conversation, will give us an opportunity to have that conversation about how do we plan California? How do we plan the budget for California? How do we have a vision of what we want, and how do we work towards that end? In not just an immediate sense, but in a multi-year sense, and doing it in a responsible way that gives the people of California some idea of what's there. I've always found when people kind of understand what you're doing, they're much more reasonable in their approach to you. When they don't understand what you're doing, they think everything's a crapshoot and that anything you do will work. So therefore, they try all the crap they can to shoot at you. And that becomes, that becomes the mode of operation. But I think if they have an idea of what the plan is, then they can kind of work with the plan. So I want to thank the both of you for giving us an opportunity to work on developing a plan for California that has a future that people can understand and that we then can implement with some sense of integrity. Thank you so very much. I look forward to the conversation around this.
Mr. Chavez.
Well, I'm happy to be here and talk to the governor and the speaker on this. I come, Mr. Governor, probably from a different perspective than the rest up here, in the sense that I'm one of the, I think, only assembly members and senators that actually was on the governor's staff, both with Schwarzenegger and yourself. And there's and when you look at government, there's a relationship between the legislative as they establish the funding of the budget, but there's also a big challenge and responsibility to the executive branch to execute it. And as I used to tell my members when I ran an agency as a secretary, you don't have to spend all the money. You need to see on how we're accomplishing our message best. So I look forward to going down this process as we talk about how we're going to do the budget. I think it's also we need to look at it and understand that this is a troubled world. What's going off in the Ukraine and what could happen in Europe could have a huge impact upon the economy of the United States, especially when you look at this pivot to the east shows clearly that there's a lot of issues overseas. And you look at the markets that we have in Asia and in Mexico, we have world challenges to our economy here. Example of Toyota leaving. So there's things out there we need to worry about. And as I was joking around with somebody, because quite frankly, I've been very pleased with how you've been managing the budget. But I said, I bet you the governor, when he passed Prop 30 to look at meeting the needs of everything, didn't count on the drought. You know, that was something probably that, God provided us. And so those are the sorts of things that go in Europe or Asia or the drought that it can impact our society or economics so greatly that we have to make a budget that can address those challenges that we do not control. So as a Republican, as a freshman who's going to be here for the next 12 years, even though I'm on this side of the dais, that's because I want to get out the back door here in a minute. The principles I like to see driving to the one major issue I think we need to do in California, and that's confidence and trust within the voters of their government. And I think hearing what you're talking about, having self-restraint within government, that's a great principle. Having flexibility to pay down the debt, you should always be flexible because when they vote for the executives or for the legislators, they ask us to use our intelligence to make the best decisions we can to solve the problems we're with. And I would also say, as I've said many times publicly since I sat on these education committees, my priority is education, because I think education is an investment within our citizens who bring the diversity of the world to our state, and we can invest in them, then we can compete in the world market. So strong education. If we keep those three principles, we'll have confidence and trust of the voters. Unlike some of the other comments made earlier, telling you, watch this nit, watch that nat, as I should tell people, don't get tripped up jumping over mouse turds. Actually drive to the objective and make something happen. The objective is self-restraint, flexibility, and take care of education, and we'll have the trust of the citizens. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Governor, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you very much for your strong leadership for a fiscally prudent budget, especially this proposal for a strengthened rainy day fund. I support a strengthened rainy day fund from my experience as a former school board member during both the boom and the bust cycle. From my experience as a school board member, I believe that we will do the greatest service for all of our school districts, our kids, our teachers, and all school staff, and all of our communities if we can provide a more stable funding for our schools and for our kids. I saw that, from my personal experience where I had to have, during the worst years, teachers crying on my shoulders, parents yelling at me for class sizes increasing. And so I support this strengthened rainy day fund very much. I would like to add that the proposal to focus on the boom and bust nature of the capital gains revenues highlights the need for tax reform. And I think that this proposal for the strengthened rainy day fund, while it will help mitigate the boom and bust cycles, that we also need to look forward for tax reform to also address this issue. But I thank you very much for your leadership.
Go ahead, Mr. Bloom.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And don't expect me to rain on this parade. I actually want to start by saying that when I arrived here in Sacramento, I was pleasantly surprised by a lot of things. But one of the great things that happened was Mr. Speaker, in presenting his blueprint, included the initial proposal for reforming the Rainy Day Fund. And for me, that resonated quite nicely because I had spent the prior 2 years talking to my constituents in Santa Monica and in my in the assembly district that I was running for about the things that I thought made up a fiscally prudent way to approach government. And I may be unique here in that I come from a city that actually had a rainy day fund, and I was able to speak to that and the sense of security and well-being that it gave to our residents in Santa Monica. And we were, I think, in part able to withstand the bad years, the down years, a little bit better, in some ways much better than other cities. Partly, I don't want to say it was the only thing, but partly because we had a solid rainy day fund in place. And Governor Brown, I want to join the everyone else here in thanking you for picking up the gauntlet and improving on what was already a good idea. The Prop 98 changes and some of the other proposals that you have made, I think, make this a significantly improved proposal now. And I agree with Mr. Murasucci that we do need to begin a conversation about tax reform. I think that it's long overdue, but that's going to take a lot of time. And the thing that we can do now is implement this as a measure that will lead to that sense of security for the people of the state of California and protect us for what will most assuredly be another downturn at some point in the future. So thank you both.
So, members, given that this is an informational hearing and we will not be voting, I think we all still have the opportunity, as do others, to do a thorough look at the proposal, because while my reading of it does give me more assurance compared to the ACA 4 in terms of a concern, as I expressed earlier, that while we want to have cushion, we also don't want to so constrain our ability to budget that, in effect, we create higher costs later. And I want to make sure that we have crafted this such that if we face, and I'll give a simple analogy, but for example, I used the analogy earlier of the high credit card debt, but let's take your roof. If we faced a situation where something was analogous to a leaky roof, and we had such a tightly constructed proposal that it didn't allow us to expend funds on the repair of that, we could create a circumstance where in year 2, year 3, year 4, we had a much greater cost as a result. So while we know that any time we are saving, we are putting constraints on expenditure. You can't save unless you put some constraints on expenditure. We want to make sure that those constraints are prudent also, because that is an aspect of prudency additionally. So I welcome a thorough review as we move through this process, and I would open the floor to our speaker and to our governor to close, if you would like.
Well, you all point to these problems that we want to restrain, but we want to be flexible. I was thinking of the analogy between that and tax reform. That on the one hand, fairness says those with the most should contribute the most, but because they have so most, they're investing in all these more chancy stocks and investments, so it goes up and down in their return. On the other hand, if you want to get a steady, absolutely predictable source of revenue, you'll have to tax kind of the basics that everybody has to pay no matter what, and then that won't feel very fair. So, like everything in life, there's always a trade-off. And to do the job, it can't be completely flexible. But to be sensible, there has to be some flexibility. Where? That's the devil in the details, and we're going to talk about that, how to make that all work. It is a kind of a conceptual puzzle. Just as I listen to everybody talking, I'm just playing it through in my mind, and I do want to acknowledge this has to be thought about very carefully. But at the end of the day, we are trying to restrain ourselves. It reminds me, since this is a rainy day fund, I think of rain. And when the rain comes, we store it, and then some people say, well, I need it this year, but then maybe what about the following year? So how much do we save and how much do we spend, and how do we decide that? And we're basically saying with this that we do need to restrain ourselves in advance when we're not quite so thirsty or so hungry. Right. So right now, with the Prop 30 money and the recovery, this is a good time to exercise a little restraint, and if it works, it will pinch to a certain degree, and that's what the goal is. So there it is. If we were angels, we wouldn't need any of these things. We would just every day and every year make very wise judgments. But we haven't proven that to be the case, so we're going to try a little bit of protective restraint, and that's what the rainy day fund is. And I look forward to working with all of you to bring it to fruition.
And perhaps, given this year, we should call it the No Rainy Day Fund. Since
And I liked another reflection I had when you said I'm going to be here for. First you said 12, and then you realize you only have 11 left. I was just thinking, where will I be in 11 years? And I added up, and I'll be 87. So I don't know what office I'll be holding then, but it probably won't be in Sacramento. But that still gives me a lot of scope.
right, Mr. Speaker.
How do you follow that? Just a little interesting observance. 6 members of this committee will be here for another 11 years. 2 are termed out this year. The remaining member will be leaving this year. And it is a really interesting contrast to look at the chair and Ms. Harkey and myself, who are amongst the last group of members who are here for the worst days of the Great Recession and the budgetary impacts, and then to look at the 6 members who will be here for 11 years who want to be thoughtful about making sure that we never put ourselves in that situation again. And so we're at this interesting moment of time where we get to bring together the experience sets of those who have been through the worst of the boom and bust and those of us who are going to be here for a long period of time and never want to experience it again. And the governor talks about water, and others have talked about water, and it really is an interesting analogy. When you look at ACA4, which this hopes to replace, ACA4 would dam up water equally in every year, regardless of circumstances, and treat revenues like you would part of a flood control system. Now, if you know anything about our response to the drought, one of the problems is the measures that the Army Corps of Engineers uses for flood control are not always consistent with what you'd want for drought management. Mm-hmm. And so what we need is smarter combinations of tools. Well, just like we need smarter combinations of tools with respect to our responses to natural disasters, as Mr. Chavez has put forward, we need smarter sets of tools with respect to what kinds of reserves and what kinds of opportunities we have for expenditures that are greatly volatile. And we believe that this is the best mechanism that we've been able to come up with to this point. There is no perfect. But looking at all of the data that we've been able to look at retrospectively, this appears to be the best set of tools. When you look at the crisis of the dot-com bust, much of it was because in the years leading up to the bust, as the markets were expanding, as the economy was growing, there was this optimistic sense that it would be a never-ending expansion. Never-ending expansions have never existed. And in each of the years in the late 90s and early 2000s, a sense of optimism took hold of the legislature and of governor. And in each of those years, the state expended more than it took in, even during times of economic expansion. The way we've gotten ourselves out of this problem, that each of the last 4 years, in contracting markets and in growing markets, both, we have been able to be thoughtful about spending less than we've taken in. We've now built a modest reserve. And the objective here is to make sure that we build an ongoing sustainable reserve, that we always balance the level of investment with our aspirations, but that we be limited by a reality that these cycles of boom and bust happen, and that we shouldn't allow ourselves to fall prey to unfettered optimism in that way, and instead create an appropriate reserve that gives us the tools to respond to crisis, but that keeps us from spending in ways that are unsustainable. We look to differentiate between one-time revenues, ongoing revenues, and short-term revenues. We know the help that's come with Prop 30. Prop 30 by design was short-term revenues. And we budget in a way that anticipates the natural dissipation of the Prop 30 revenues. But we also know that there are years where there are spikes. This is a year with spikes. CalPERS and CalSTRS had a 19.26% return. those aren't sustainable levels of return year over year. So we can't make budgetary decisions or long-term decisions with an anticipation that those continue to exist. And so 20 years of retroactive looks at revenues have helped us identify the 6.5% number as a very good predictor of whether your revenues are sustainable or not. And it is for us to make sure that we leave the state better than we found it. And we believe that this is the best tool that we've been able to find. And both the governor and I look forward to working with all of you as we continue to refine this and bring it up for a vote. But we need to do it in a timely manner. This needs to be something that we do before we pass the next budget, because every budget is a set of assumptions about what's going to happen over the course of the next year. It is essential that we know what our approach to a rainy day fund is before we engage in the meat of the budget for the next year, because it really does lay the foundation. So we look forward to working with you, but we look forward to doing it in a very expedited time frame. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both for presenting to us, the committee and the chair. Appreciate it greatly, and we look forward with working together and moving before the budget. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you.